Do you have any favorite concept albums that aren't the Beatles? Or
Yeah, I think Dark Side of the Moon's a great album.
yeah,
He wrote Yesterday. He wrote Let It Be. He made melody seem like breathing.
then you can start to make it better.
For over 60 years, Paul McCartney has been music's eternal optimist, the craftsman who turned 3 minutes into forever. But behind every perfect hook lived a student, a listener who never stopped learning. Paul did not just create, he was absorbed. He studied the architects who came before him, the rebels who broke the rules, the dreamers who built cathedrals from sound. These 8 albums were not just favorites. They were untouchable, sacred ground. The standards Paul spent a lifetime chasing.
We kind of looked at that and said, Everest. It's kind of, it's big, it's heroic. That could be good for the album. So I thought, well, that could be the new album. I like that kind of thing, so I put some of these images in the painting.
Here is what shaped the man who shaped everything. 8. Here's Little Richard. Before Paul screamed, Little Richard showed him how. Released in 1957, Here's Little Richard was not an album. It was an earthquake. The piano did not just play, it attacked. Little Richard's voice did not sing, it exploded.
And now you wanna leave.
And young Paul McCartney, sitting in his Liverpool living room, heard something that rewired his soul. This was not polite. This was not safe. This was freedom wrapped in chaos. Paul once said, Little Richard taught me that music could be dangerous and joyful at the same time. Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, Rip It Up. These were not songs. They were declarations of war against boredom. Every note was soaked in sweat and rebellion.
Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, that's what you meant to say, right? Yeah.
All right.
That I use on a few records with the Beatles was actually a Little Richard impression.
Little Richard did not ask permission. He took the stage like it owed him money. And Paul, the boy who would become a Beatle, paid attention. What struck Paul most was the energy. It was relentless. Little Richard never coasted, never pulled back. He screamed himself hoarse on every track, and somehow it felt like love. The piano pounded. The band raced to keep up. And underneath all that chaos was precision. Little Richard knew exactly what he was doing. He was controlled by wildness, disciplined insanity. That paradox fascinated Paul. Here's Little Richard was the first album that made Paul want to perform, not just play music, but own a stage, to move bodies and blow minds. When the Beatles covered Long Tall Sally, Paul channeled that same raw joy. He screamed until his throat burned. He let himself be possessed, because Little Richard taught him that sometimes music is not about being pretty, it is about being alive. 7. Elvis Presley. This was the beginning. The spark, the moment everything changed. When Elvis Presley's debut album dropped in 1956, Paul was 14 years old and hungry for something he could not name. Then he heard that voice.
I don't care if I spend my dough, 'cause tonight I'm gonna be the one. I have it, so I wanna rock it up.
Velvet wrapped around danger, charm soaked in rebellion. Elvis did not just sing, he seduced. And Paul, like millions of others, surrendered completely.
Elvis Presley? He was great. He was a really great guy. We just admired him so much.
Blue suede shoes, I Got a Woman, Tutti Frutti. The album was a riot of influences. Gospel, blues, country, rock, all smashed together with confidence that felt illegal. Elvis made it sound easy, effortless, like he woke up one morning and decided to change the world before breakfast. Paul studied that ease. That's cool. He wanted it. He chased it for the rest of his life. What Paul admired most was Elvis's voice. It could do anything, soft as a whisper on Love Me Tender, raw as gravel on Shake, Rattle, and Roll. Elvis had control, but he hid it. He made you think he was just being himself. That authenticity, real or manufactured, was magnetic. Paul learned that the best performances do not feel like performances. They feel like confessions. 6. After School Session, Chuck Berry made storytelling look like a science. Released in 1957, After School Session was a masterclass in economics.
Toe. Round and round and round you go.
Every line mattered. Every rhyme landed. Chuck did not waste a single word, and Paul, who would go on to write some of the tightest pop songs in history, took notes. This was the blueprint. This is how you say everything in 3 minutes and make it last forever.
I say, is that early Chuck Berry? You know, it's all from gospel, you know, it's all
Straight out the
it's all,
church.
it's all
Yeah.
there, yeah.
School days, too much monkey business, brown-eyed handsome man. Chuck wrote about teenage life with wit and precision. He documented a world that adults ignored. The frustration of school, the thrill of freedom, the need to move, to dance, to live. Paul heard those songs and thought, this is poetry disguised as rock and roll. Chuck was not just entertaining, he was archiving a generation. The guitar work was revolutionary. Chuck's riffs were clean, sharp, unforgettable. They did not just accompany the song, they were the songs. Paul, who played bass, understood structure. He knew that a great riff could carry everything. Chuck Berry proved that. His guitar lines were so strong you could hum them like melodies. Paul absorbed that. He built his bass lines with the same clarity, the same purpose. 5. The chirping crickets. This one was personal. Buddy Holly was not flashy. He did not scream or gyrate. He wore glasses. He looked like a regular kid from Texas. But when he sang, magic happened.
So you can see your love was meant for me.
The Chirping Crickets, released in 1957, was as simple as genius. And Paul, who shared Buddy's gift for melody, saw himself in those grooves. Buddy was the songwriter's songwriter, the proof that you did not need gimmicks. You just needed songs.
But yeah, and we love Buddy, and I think the other reason we love Buddy was that he wrote.
That'll Be the Day, Not Fade Away, oh boy. These were not complicated. They were perfect. 3 chords, honest lyrics, and melodies that stuck like glue. Buddy Holly understood something essential. Emotion does not need complexity. It needs truth. Paul learned that lesson early and never forgot it. Yesterday, there were 3 chords. Let It Be is 4. Simplicity, when done right, is unstoppable. Buddy was also a pioneer. He wrote his own songs. He produced his own records. He controlled his sound. In the late 1950s, that was rare. Most artists were puppets. Buddy was a craftsman. Paul admired that independence. When the Beatles fought for creative control, they were following Buddy's example. When Paul started producing himself, he was honoring Buddy's legacy. The tragedy of Buddy's death in 1959 hit Paul hard. He was only 22, gone at the peak of his powers. But the music remained. That'll Be the Day still sounded perfect decades later. Paul carried that grief and that admiration his entire career. He even bought the publishing rights to Buddy's catalog, not to profit, but to protect. Buddy Holly was untouchable, and Paul made sure the world would never forget. 4. Motown's greatest hits. Motown was the factory Paul wished he owned, not a factory of products, but of perfection. Every song was crafted with surgical precision. The bass lines locked tight, the harmonies shimmered, the production glowed. Berry Gordy built an empire on quality control, and Paul studied every release like scripture. Motown taught him that hits were not accidents. They were blueprints executed flawlessly.
The band, there was such energy, and we were so kind of clear direction as what we wanted to do.
My Girl Ain't Too Proud to Beg. I heard it through the grapevine. Reach out, I'll be there. These were not just songs. They were monuments. Paul listened to the bass lines especially. James Jamerson played like a composer. His bass did not just keep time, it told stories. Paul absorbed that approach. His bass lines on Come Together, Something, and Drive My Car were not background noise. They were architecture. Motown also taught Paul about arrangement. Every instrument had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. The tambourine hit on the 2 and 4. The strings swelled at exactly the right moment. The backing vocals answered the lead like a conversation. It was mathematical, but it felt like a soul. That balance, precision without coldness, became Paul's obsession. He wanted songs that were both perfect and human. 3. Pet Sounds. This was the album that changed everything. When Pet Sounds arrived in 1966, Paul was already a Beatle. already successful, already confident. Then he heard what Brian Wilson had done, and suddenly, he was a student again. Pet Sounds was not just an album. It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown. Brian had pushed the boundaries of what pop music could be, and Paul, competitive to his core, had to respond. God only knows, wouldn't it be nice I just wasn't made for these times. These songs were heartbreak wrapped in beauty. Brian Wilson took sadness and made it sound like heaven. The arrangements were orchestral, lush, impossibly detailed. Pet Sounds was not recorded. It was sculpted. Every note placed with intention. Every harmony is stacked with care. Paul heard it and thought, we have to go deeper. What impressed Paul most was Brian's courage. The Beach Boys were known for surf rock and car songs. Pet Sounds was introspective, melancholic, and vulnerable. Brian risked everything to make it, and it was not a commercial smash. It confused people, but Paul got it immediately. He understood that great art sometimes meant alienating your audience, that safety was the enemy of genius. Pet Sounds directly inspired Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Paul admitted it openly. He heard what Brian did and wanted to go further. The Beatles responded with an album that was concept, theater, and experimentation all at once. But it started with Pet Sounds, with Brian Wilson showing Paul that the studio was not just a tool, it was an instrument, and if you played it right, you could build worlds. 2. A Love Supreme. Paul did not just listen to rock. He listened to everything. And when A Love Supreme came out in 1965, Paul heard something sacred. John Coltrane was not writing songs. He was channeling something higher. This was jazz as prayer, music as a spiritual journey. And Paul, who would later write Let It Be and The Long and Winding Road, understood that music could touch the divine. A Love Supreme is a 4-part suite. It is complex, intense, and searching. Coltrane's saxophone does not just play notes. It asks questions. It cries. It pleases. It reaches for something beyond language. Paul listened and realized that music did not need words to communicate. Sometimes the purest expression was instrumental. That is why he wrote Eleanor Rigby with strings, why he used orchestras on Beatles records. Coltrane showed him that emotion could live in arrangement. What Paul admired most was Coltrane's commitment. A Love Supreme was not easy to listen to. It demanded attention. It required patience. But if you gave it time, it rewarded you with transcendence. Paul carried that lesson into his own work. Not every song had to be a single. Not every melody had to be obvious. Sometimes depth mattered more than accessibility. 1. Inner Visions. This was mastery, pure, undeniable mastery. When Inner Visions dropped in 1973, Paul was deep into Wings, trying to prove he could succeed without the Beatles.
I'm so high, I feel like I'm about to die.
Then Stevie Wonder released an album that did everything. Writing, producing, performing, arranging. Stevie did it all, and he did it perfectly. Paul listened and thought, this is what complete artistry looks like. Living for the City, Higher Ground, Golden Lady, Visions. Every track was a statement. Stevie sang about social justice, spirituality, love, and struggle. The production was warm, funky, futuristic. The Moog synthesizers added texture without gimmick. The rhythms were tight, but loose. Everything felt alive, organic, and somehow, it was all Stevie. One man building a universe. What Paul admired most was Stevie's fearlessness. He was blind, but he saw more than most. He was a pop star, but he refused to make shallow music. Inner Visions tackled poverty, inequality, and faith without preaching. It was protest music that grooved. It was spiritual music that made you dance. That balance, serious without being heavy, was something Paul always chased. Stevie Wonder showed Paul what the future could be. An artist who controlled every aspect of their work, who did not compromise, who pushed technology forward while keeping the soul intact. Paul spent the rest of his career trying to match that standard, not to copy Stevie, but to honor him. Inner Visions were untouchable, not because it was perfect, because it was complete. And completeness, Paul learned, was the highest form of art. Paul McCartney spent 60 years chasing perfection. These 8 albums were his North Star, the standards he could never quite reach but never stopped pursuing. Greatness is not born in isolation. It is built on the shoulders of those who came before. If this journey through Paul's influences moved you, subscribe for more untold stories from music's greatest minds.